business strategy. This game's an interesting study, actually. It's a case study in the idea that simply creating a simulative model and putting it in a competitive game environment does not produce reasonable results. This is actually almost a lift-off, yes, certainly it's a simplification, but it covers all the basics of managing a business properly, right? You're paying these fixed costs for your plant, for storage, you're paying for production. You have this market. Now, here's the one thing. You have no input into the market. That is the one thing that's missing from this model. And it actually makes it kind of, or very little input into the market. You have this advertising ability. But what you buy and sell things at, what prices you're able to obtain at other points, what your bids are, they don't influence the market at all. And that is unreasonable. You know, I mean, if I'm selling cars at $5,000 a unit wholesale, say, and not today, obviously, at one year or 1 month, I'm not going to turn around and be able to just demand $7,000 the next month. Not easily. And then the next month, you know, it's not going to drop down to 3,000. The markets don't fluctuate that much. There's a lot of business continuity going on. They do fluctuate that much in some areas where there's extremes in the supply and demand. So, for example, you'll see that in, say, livestock futures and stuff like that. But the actual producers are hedging the bet with those futures markets, to tell you the truth. And they're guaranteeing that they're going to get a certain amount anyway. Businesses do not run in this kind of wildly fluctuating environment, usually. So it's hard to come up with a model to come up with an example that this actually models. But in a lot of ways, the game would be less interesting if you took that away. And what you really come up with in this game is this idea that, or this understanding that the world obviously is not a purely competitive situation. And that's pretty clear if you think about it. General Motors and Ford and Chrysler may be competing with one another. They may be trying to get a higher market share, but they are not competing on the level that, say, sub-19th century railways were. Railways would indeed actually go into a city, build the track, and essentially ship goods for free. It would be cheaper to ship through a given city out of your way, completely, you know, miss the closest direct route in order to go through a city that was under a price war of that type. But there was an intended victory, which was you would drive the other person out of that market. Here, the intended victory is to drive all your competitors completely out of the business. This might be the case in some small startup type situations, you know. It might be the case that one brand is all that can survive. Likely. But unless that's the obvious situation, most businesses do not run that way. And that's sort of what makes this kind of uninteresting, is that, okay, well, you know, you modeled a lot of the different pieces correctly, but the general goal that's driving the foundation of a business is not sink my competitors and or make sure I do better than them, usually. It may be in some cases. The kinds that I noted, it also may be important for a president of a company to outperform their competitors, and in a sense, failure may be a better, maybe almost as good as unbad an option, almost as decent an option as, being the laggard industry, being the laggard company in an industry. But it's just very hard to justify, and it leaves me walking away from this game with kind of a bad taste in my mouth for it, because it is just such a purely cutthroat environment in the game. Given that it's a pure competitive game, given that you actually don't give a shit how badly your company performs, so long as it does better than other people's and destroys their companies, well, the next company to come along might just have a better model in place. And you've already been so weakened by this fight that they can finish you off without as much effort as you had to put into this. Companies are about making money, not about necessarily trying to establish a monopoly that quite possibly regulation would destroy anyway. And that's kind of the issue. If this were a pure free market economy, well, a purely laissez-faire market economy, not a free market, where you could try to develop a monopoly by just outlasting 3 of your competitors, and then from then on you're in perfect shape. That is a model that this game fits, but it doesn't fit one that it seems to portray, which is almost American capitalism, which does not really suffer from this kind of chronic undercutting and race to the bottom type techniques that this game really advocates as the only way or the best way to win. Now, we saw, though, as I was playing, that there were times when things were kind of flush from the cards, and because the market was no longer as harsh as it had been, sort of the base inclination was not to do that rush to the bottom. But the truth of the matter is, it doesn't matter what the market is. That race to the bottom technique can be used at any point. At any point. It's harder to do when the market is going well for the players, when prices can be high. Merely because they're kind of making this guess, well, how bad is he going to do this? Is he going to prevent me from selling at a reasonable price, even though he can maybe get a pretty reasonable price? What kind of chance are people going to take? There's a sort of push your luck with the other players atmosphere to it. It's also quite possible, as we saw with those flush economy, that, hey, however many I produce, I'm going to make maximum money off this. But you can still then, as soon as the market starts going bad, do damage to your competition, as long as you can undercut them. The number at which you undercut them can be calculated. You can look at your production, based on what you're paying out in terms of the fixed expenses that you have, what you're paying out in terms of possible new raw materials that you're buying, and production costs, and determine exactly what strategy will lose you the least money. Leaving everything fallow is going to lose you a decent amount of money. So then the question becomes, okay, how low can I bid? How low a bid can I get away with without the other player undercutting me? Or how high a bid can I get away with without the other player undercutting me? Can that be absolutely optimized? No, because the other guy can slit his wrists worse than you do, right? So then, yes, it becomes this game of chicken rather than something that's purely calculable. You can come up with the margin by which I'm losing at a slower rate than if I closed everything. And that could be your benchmark. but you still have this ability to kind of guess the other guy's going to fuzz, try to push that number a little higher, or the other guy's going to say, all right, you know what? I'm not going to go through that step of closing my factories, because if I do that, I open the game up and other players can then run free there. I'm going to lose more than I would lose if I shut everything down. But by doing that, by remaining open, if other people take that option to shut down, then I can make more money. So, it really is not completely calculable, even when the card comes up. Another thing that throws a real monkey wrench into it is the advertising. Again, you can calculate how much that advertising can bring you, but what you can't do is figure out what your opponent's going to bid. He might bid above what your optimal bid. Oh, wow, not optimal. Your optimal bid would be to get it at $50, right? He might look at your break-even bid, if that's what you're choosing to take, and say, well, I can beat that and I'll still lose money, but he will not make the gain that he would make if he makes this bid. He will actually lose more because he's going to make that optimal, that break-even bid and not break even. Whereas I'm going to make a bid that actually loses me money, but I'm gaining something off the bid that I made because I beat him. Of course, somebody else might beat both of you, and then you're really out a whole lot. So it really is this... it's just a very depressing thing to play in some ways. It's kind of humorous to do. I really enjoyed, once I realized what it was, sort of the first turn or two of realizing how horribly, perverted a view of business this ends up giving you. This is not just creative destruction. This is just destruction. This is the race to the bottom. This is the kind of thing that you might see in an 18xx game. But you see nothing come of it. You don't see advances of trains or anything like that. All you see is, well, my company's losing money at a far slower rate than yours is. That is not an impressive thing to feel at the end of a game. So it kind of doesn't capture the feel of the growth of businesses. It captures the feel of unrestrained attempts to try to get a grip on a monopoly. It gives you hankerings back to, say, what the Hunt brothers tried to do with the silver market and ended up bankrupting themselves. That kind of activity, that kind of concept, that the goal is some golden apple, but man, when you look at what you did to the company, you may not be in a position to anymore take advantage of the monopoly you just sort of fought so hard for. Anyway, that's kind of my feel about it. It leaves me feeling a little bit less happy than even Executive Decision, which feels like a more trimmed down game, but has this mechanism that allows you to play with the supply and demand of different items. Here you don't have that ability. Prices fluctuate. Core price fluctuates based on what the supply and demand is in that game. And that actually works to be something really neat in Star Trader, which allows you to move ships around, and you're actually physically moving commodities and playing on these commodity markets rather than worrying about production so much. Trying to think if there's another one that I want to think about like this. No. Compared to something like, what I played recently, the Crusoe's Planet, this is something I could see playing once kind of for a look at how horrible, look at how harsh it can be. That's a harsh game, but that's a harsh game in a fun sort of way because there's so many things to investigate. The levers you have to play with in this, it doesn't suggest, tinkering with the game or something, but I inadvertently changed the price of production. It still didn't change the game terribly. The same goal is still there. I can't think of anything in this game that would make it really kind of work out so that you're not just trying to wreck your opponents rather than... There's no goal towards building your company up, as far as I can see. Anyway, that's what I have to say for my fairly limited playing of this. Not just this time, but previously we played, for a few hours. And kind of said, well, That wasn't terribly interesting, but it was kind of funny. All right, up it goes.